I spent 31 years working as a family court mediator. People brought me their worst moments: custody disputes, restraining orders, financial disclosures that made grown men weep. I learned early that the most dangerous situations rarely announce themselves loudly. They arrive quietly, dressed in something that looks almost like love. I never thought I would sit across from my own daughter and recognize the signs. Her name is Nora. She was 34 when she married Conrad. He was charming in that specific way that takes practice. The kind of man who remembers your coffee order the first time you meet and somehow makes that feel like intimacy. He shook my hand at our first introduction and said, "I've heard so much about you. Nora says you're the strongest woman she knows." He smiled like he meant it. I believed him. That is the part that still sits uncomfortably with me even now. I believed him. Nora had always been independent. She worked in hospital administration, managed a team of 12, could read a balance sheet the way most people read a menu. She ran half marathons on weekends, not because she needed to prove anything, just because she liked the feeling of her body doing what she told it to. She had been on her own since 24, never called me asking for money, never needed me to fix anything. She was the child other mothers bragged about when I wasn't in the room. So when she started talking about Conrad, I listened with the particular kind of attention I gave to things that mattered, and what I heard sounded good. He was an architect. He was thoughtful. He made her laugh. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. The wedding was in October, out in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the light that afternoon was the kind that makes everything look like a memory while it's still happening. I cried. Her father, my ex-husband, we have stayed friends, leaned over and whispered, "She looks happy." I nodded. She did. I want to be precise about when things changed, but precision is hard when change moves that slowly. The first thing I noticed was her voice, not what she said, how she said it. When Nora called me, and the calls were becoming less frequent by then, which I had attributed to newlywed life, to settling in, to the ordinary business of building a marriage, she started speaking more carefully. There is a word for it. Measured. Like someone reading from a script they've nearly memorized but haven't quite internalized. She would tell me about her week, and the sentences would be complete and pleasant, and somehow empty. I am a mediator. I have spent decades listening to what people do not say. I noticed. I told myself I was projecting. The second thing was the visits. Before the wedding, Nora came to my house in Richmond every few weeks. She would show up on a Saturday morning with coffee from the place on Carey Street she knew I liked, and we would sit on my back porch and talk for 3 hours and not notice the time. After the wedding, the visits became rarer. When they happened, Conrad was always there. Which is natural. I understood that. He was her husband. But Conrad, I began to realize, was very good at being present in a way that made other conversations impossible. He would finish Nora's sentences, not aggressively, warmly even, like he was so attuned to her that he knew what she was going to say. When she laughed, he would touch her arm. When she spoke about work, he would add context. Nora tends to underplay how hard she works, in a way that seemed like a compliment, and yet somehow redirected the conversation back to him. I started watching her hands when he did this. She would stop. Whatever she had been about to say would simply stop, like water meeting a closed valve. I told myself marriages have their rhythms. I told myself I was an aging mother reading too much into nothing. The third thing I noticed was the weight. Not much. 10 pounds, maybe 12. In a woman who had been running half marathons. She told me she'd been tired from work. I asked if she was sleeping well. She said yes, quickly, the way people say yes when they don't want to discuss the actual answer. I said nothing. I scheduled a dinner. I invited them both for Thanksgiving. Conrad's family was invited too. His mother, Vivian, and his younger sister, Paige, who was 26 and quiet in a way that seemed like she was waiting for permission to speak. I cooked everything from scratch the way I always do. My sweet potato casserole, my grandmother's cornbread dressing, green beans slow-cooked with smoked turkey neck. I had been making this meal for 40 years, and I know exactly what I am doing. Vivian arrived first. She walked into my house and looked around the way some people look at real estate they are deciding whether to purchase. Not hostile. Appraising. She accepted the glass of wine I offered and sat at my kitchen island and watched me work. After a few minutes, she said, "Conrad's grandmother always made her stuffing with oysters. He does love that tradition." I smiled. I said, "I'll have to get that recipe sometime." She said, "It wouldn't quite translate. It's a very specific thing." That was the first exchange. I filed it away. When Nora and Conrad arrived, my daughter hugged me and I felt, for just a moment, that she held on a half second longer than usual. Or maybe I imagined it. Conrad shook my hand, complimented the house, "You have such a warm eye for a space," and immediately fell into easy conversation with no one in particular, the way men who are accustomed to being listened to move through a room. Dinner began well enough. It was Vivian who started it, and I want to be careful here because I recognized what she was doing even as it was happening. She did it the way a surgeon uses a scalpel. Small, precise movements, each one individually unremarkable, collectively devastating. She tasted the cornbread dressing and said, "This is so interesting. Conrad, doesn't this remind you of what they serve at that diner we used to stop at, off I-81? Conrad said, "A little." She said, "That place had such a homey quality. Everything just a little rustic." Nora said nothing. She kept her eyes on her plate. I said pleasantly, "I learned this recipe from my grandmother. She fed 14 people every holiday with it. I like to think it's held up." Vivian smiled. Of course. 20 minutes passed. The conversation moved to other things. And then Nora made a small comment, something about a project she was leading at the hospital, a scheduling overhaul that had taken her team 6 months, and Conrad cut in. Not cruelly. That is the part that is hard to explain to people who haven't seen it. He didn't raise his voice or dismiss her. He simply began speaking while she was speaking. Just a fraction too early, and what she had been saying dissolved into what he was saying, and no one acknowledged that anything had happened. He talked about the project as though it were something he had watched from a comfortable distance, describing her team's work in past tense, in summary, as if she had already finished telling the story and he was providing the analysis. Nora's hands stopped moving. I watched her pick up her fork again, deliberate, careful, like someone reminding themselves of the correct way to act. Vivian said, "Conrad has always had such a clear eye for these things." I set my fork down. I reached for my water glass. I made myself breathe. Paige, across the table, looked at her own plate. It was near the end of the meal when it happened. Nora had gone to the kitchen to help me bring out the desserts, and she said something to me under her breath. Not words exactly, more like a sound, exhausted and small. And I turned to look at her, and what I saw on her face was not sadness. It was something past sadness. It was the expression of someone who has stopped expecting things to be different. I put my hand over hers. I didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. We stood there for a moment in my kitchen, just the two of us, and I made a decision without making it consciously, the way you sometimes know something before you know that you know it. We brought out the pie. Conrad tasted it and said something about the crust being a little dense. He said it gently, the way a person offers a helpful observation. Vivian nodded in agreement. I watched Nora's face. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked braced, like she had known it was coming and had already absorbed it before it arrived. That was when I understood that this was not new, that whatever I was seeing at this table was not a bad night or a difficult season or an adjustment period. This was a household. This was the atmosphere in which my daughter lived. I excused myself briefly after dessert. I went to my bedroom. I sat on the edge of my bed for approximately 4 minutes. Then I opened my phone and called Deborah. Deborah has been my closest friend since 1987. She is also a licensed clinical social worker who has spent the last 20 years specializing in domestic abuse intervention. She has worked with hundreds of families. She has testified in court. She wrote a chapter in a book that gets assigned in graduate programs. I did not call her because I was panicking. I called her because I knew exactly what I had seen and I needed someone else to confirm that I was not wrong about it, that my 30 years of professional training were telling me the truth. She answered on the second ring. I said quietly, "I need about 3 minutes." She said, "I'm here." I told her what I had watched at that table. The interruptions, the small erasures, Vivian's comments, Nora's hands, the brace in her daughter's face when a grown man critiqued her mother's pie at her mother's table. Deborah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long do you think it's been going on?" I said, "At least a year, maybe longer." She said, "Is Nora safe tonight?" I said, "She's here with me?" She said, "Okay. Then we start tomorrow." I went back to the table. I poured more coffee. I smiled at Vivian and I talked to Paige about her nursing program, and I made a pleasant and neutral and utterly unremarkable conversation for the remaining 45 minutes of that evening. Conrad said something on the way out about what a lovely time he'd had. I said I was so glad. I hugged Nora at the door and held on for a moment and whispered, "Call me tomorrow. Just you." She looked at me. Something crossed her face, not surprise exactly, but recognition, like she had been waiting for someone to say exactly that and had stopped believing anyone would. She nodded. She called at 8 the next morning. Conrad had gone to meet a client. She sat in her car in the parking garage of their building and talked to me for 90 minutes, and what came out was not one incident, but dozens, small and large, stretched across 2 years, a continuous quiet pressure that had slowly reoriented her entire sense of what was normal. The checking of her phone, the commentary on her friendships, the way he managed their joint finances, always with a reasonable explanation, always in a way that left her without independent access to anything significant. The gradual narrowing of her world until her world was mostly him. She cried once, briefly, and then stopped herself. "I sound like one of your cases," she said. I said, "You sound like my daughter." After we hung up, I called Deborah again, and then I called Nora's longtime friend Greta, who is an attorney and who I knew had been quietly worried for months. And then I called the bank. I want to be clear about this part because people sometimes misunderstand it. I did not do anything dramatic. I did not show up at their apartment. I did not confront Conrad. I did not call the police because at that point there was no legal incident to report, and I have spent enough time in family court to know that a poorly timed confrontation can make a dangerous situation more dangerous. What I did was build a structure around my daughter before she knew she needed one. Greta began quietly documenting. I started a folder. I'm a mediator. Documentation is in my blood. Dates, incidents, Nora's own words from our phone calls, noting when she repeated certain phrases that sounded like they had been repeated to her. I reached out to the Employee Assistance Program at Nora's hospital and confirmed, without mentioning specifics, that confidential counseling services were available to staff. And I waited, carefully, patiently. The way I have learned to wait in 31 years of this work. It took 4 months. In March, Nora came to my house alone on a Sunday morning. She stood in my kitchen and she told me that she had found an apartment, that she had already called the bank, that she had already spoken to an attorney, that she was not asking for my permission or my validation. She just wanted me to know. She was shaking slightly, not from fear, from the effort of holding something enormous with complete steadiness. I said, "Tell me what you need." She said, "I already have it mostly handled. I just need you to know." I said, "Then I know." We stood in my kitchen for a moment. Then she sat down and I made us both coffee and we talked for a long time, not about Conrad, but about her, about what she wanted her next year to look like, about whether she wanted her next year to look like, about whether she was going to go back to running, about a friend from college she'd lost touch with and wanted to call. Conrad did not take the separation quietly. There were difficult weeks. Legal things I will not detail here, because they are not the part of this story that matters. Greta was prepared. The documentation was prepared. Conrad discovered, apparently to his genuine surprise, that my daughter had not been as alone as he'd arranged for her to be. Vivian called me once. She said some things. I let her finish. Then I said, "I hope your son finds a way to become someone better." I hung up. Paige texted Nora the following week. She said she was sorry. She said she had seen things she hadn't known how to respond to. Nora texted back, and they have stayed in tentative contact since then, which I think speaks to something. That even in the households where these things take root, there are sometimes people who simply did not know what to do. That is the part I think about in the early mornings when I am drinking my coffee and the house is quiet. Not Conrad, not Vivian. I think about Paige, 26 years old, sitting at my Thanksgiving table, staring at her plate. She knew something was wrong. She had known for longer than I had, and she did not know that knowing gave her any right to act. That is what I want people to hear if they hear anything from this. Knowing is a right. Acting on it is a right. You do not have to wait for someone to tell you that what you are seeing is real. You do not have to wait until it reaches a threshold that someone else would recognize as serious enough. You are allowed to open your phone and call the person who knows what to do. You are allowed to say quietly in someone's ear at the door, "Call me tomorrow, just you." Nora runs again now. On Saturday mornings, the long route, the one that loops through the park by the river. She told me last month that she ran 8 miles without stopping and felt like she could have kept going. She said the air felt different than it used to. I knew what she meant. She was not talking about the air. I am 63 years old. I spent my career in rooms where things had already gone very wrong and people were trying to salvage whatever remained. I have sat across from women who waited years longer than Nora waited, and I have sat across from children who grew up thinking what they saw at home was what love was supposed to look like. I am not telling you this story because it ended well, though it did. I am telling you this story because for 6 months, I looked at my daughter and told myself I was seeing things. I am telling you this because 31 years of professional training did not make me immune to the very human instinct to believe that the people we love are okay. Trust what you see, not what you hope. And if you are the one sitting at someone's table right now, watching someone stare at their plate, you have already seen enough. The question is only what you decide to do with what you've seen. So, I'll ask you what I always like to ask. What did this story bring up for you? And what city are you watching from tonight? I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately. Not in any abstract way, just in the plain, practical way that comes from watching what actually happens when people make choices. Over time, in real life, Conrad made choices, small ones at first. He chose to speak while Nora was speaking. He chose to manage the money in a way that left her without footing. He chose to let his mother sit at my table and call my grandmother's cornbread rustic. Each of those choices was small enough to explain away, and he was skilled at the explaining. But choices compound. They build structures. And the structure Conrad built, choice by choice over 2 years, was one designed to make my daughter smaller. What I've come to believe, not from religion, not from anything outside of just watching human beings over 31 years, is that what you build eventually holds you too. Conrad thought he was building control. What he actually built was a case, documentation, a pattern clear enough that when the time came, there was nothing to dispute. His own consistency worked against him. He had been so careful, so methodical in his erosion of Nora, that the evidence of it was everywhere once someone started looking. That is what I mean when I think about cause and effect. Not punishment from somewhere outside, just the natural weight of what you've chosen, arriving. And Nora, I want to say something about Nora because this story is hers more than it is anyone else's. She did not need me to rescue her. I want to be clear about that. When she came to my kitchen that Sunday morning in March, she had already found the apartment. She had already found the apartment. She had already called the bank. She had already spoken to an attorney. What she needed from me was not a plan. She had the plan. What she needed was to say it out loud to someone who would not flinch, who would not try to talk her out of it, or slow her down, or ask her if she was sure. That is something I think about often. How much of what the people we love need from us is simply to be believed. To have someone look at what they're telling you and say, "Yes, I see it too." You are not wrong about what you saw. Nora had the intelligence to understand her situation clearly. She had the moral clarity to know it was wrong, even when Conrad worked very hard to make her doubt that clarity. And she had the endurance, quiet, private, sustained over months, to hold herself together long enough to build a real exit rather than just escape. Those three things together are what I keep coming back to. Knowing what is true, knowing what is right, and staying in it long enough to do something real about it. None of those things came from me. They were already in her. I just made one phone call and kept a folder and made sure she knew, without saying it directly, that there was someone in her corner who was paying attention. Sometimes that is all a person needs, not rescue, just witness. She runs 8 miles on Saturday mornings now. She called me last week to tell me about a friend from college she'd reconnected with. She laughed on the phone in the way she used to laugh before she learned to measure everything. I am 63 years old. I know that life does not always resolve this cleanly. I know that not every Nora finds her way out in 4 months, and I know that some of them are still sitting at tables right now, bracing themselves before the critique lands. If that is you, or if that is someone you love, trust what you have seen. You already know enough. The question is only whether you are willing to act on what you know. And I'll ask you the same thing I always do. What did this bring up for you tonight, and what city are you watching from?